Welcome to Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Quidu, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting the evolution of consciousness as the key to individual growth and global healing. We do this through online interviews and presentations by guest speakers, classes, and study groups. We draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading edge studies in science, consciousness, spirituality, and philosophy. We've been doing this for the past 18, almost 19 years, but in 2019, we began recording our presentations. Our video recordings are viewable through our website, caritascenter.org, and on our YouTube channel, which is the Caritas Consciousness Project. As a nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our members and donors to keep our program going. If you enjoy our presentations and would like to support this program, you can make a donation or become a member on our website. And now let me introduce our guest speaker. Anne Baring is a Jungian analyst, author of The Dream of the Cosmos, A Quest for the Soul, which I am absolutely loving. Not quite finished. It's a big book, but I just love it. And also co-author of 7 books, including with Jules Cashford, The Myth of the Goddess and the Evolution of an Image, with Andrew Harvey, The Mystic Vision and the Divine Feminine, with Scylla Elworthy, Soul Power, An Agenda for a Conscious Humanity. And also she wrote a book for children, which is also, I would say, for children and adults, The Bird Who Flew Beyond Time, which comes from a Sufi story, I believe. Her most recent book, The Dream of the Cosmos, the one I'm reading, Quest for the Soul, was updated and reprinted in 2020 and originally published in 2013. And was awarded the Scientific and Medical Network Book Prize for 2013 when it was published. The ground of all her work is a deep interest in the spiritual, mythological, shamanic, and artistic traditions of different cultures. Her websites are devoted to the affirmation of a new vision of reality and the issues facing us at this crucial time. Okay, so welcome, Anne. Thank you so much for coming to us all the way from UK and making time to be with us this evening.
Well, it's a very great pleasure. And as I say, all's well that worked out well.
Yes,
with the timing.
Well, as well.
So shall I share my screen now?
Sure, if you're all ready to do your presentation, sure.
There we are.
Yes.
So are you happy for me to start?
Yes, absolutely. Whenever you're ready.
Okay. Well, I'm starting really with this, that more and more of us are feeling a profound love for the earth, our home, in the vastness of the cosmos. And this new experience, or relatively new experience of love and empathy, I think has the power to raise our consciousness to a higher level, bringing us into closer relationship with our soul and the higher reaches of the cosmos, and helping us to relinquish old beliefs and old struggles for power that are based on fear and ignorance rather than love. In Eckhart Tolle's words, the transformation of human consciousness is no longer a luxury available only to a few individuals, but a necessity if humanity is not to destroy itself. And I was thinking today, we get downloads, as Gloria knows, and today I had a download saying, mention the Annunciation. So the Annunciation, I think, is what's happening now with all the people who are working for a new world, trying to lift human consciousness out of the old patterns. I really do see it as an Annunciation. So I just wanted to add that in. Now, His Holiness the Dalai Lama calls for a new awakening in this book. And in relation to what we're witnessing in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, He has in the past said this about war. He said, war and the large military establishments are the greatest sources of violence in the world. Whether their purpose is defensive or offensive, these vast, powerful organizations exist solely to kill human beings. We should think carefully about the reality of war. War is monstrous. Its very nature is one of tragedy and suffering. We can all see this in front of our noses at this moment. On March the 25th, together with other organizations and individuals, he sent out this message to the world. The time to ban and eliminate nuclear weapons is now. If it is either the end of nuclear weapons or the end of us. So here I found this picture of Putin's latest nuclear weapon, which he was boasting about recently. And this weapon can travel 27 times faster than the speed of sound and has a range of over 6,000 miles. It carries 15, not one, but 15 nuclear missiles, each capable of destroying a whole city. So if this was released together to their different destinations, these missiles could wipe out a country the size of Ukraine or the size of France, which is roughly the same as Ukraine. There's no defense against it. It would be the end of the whole population. So we need to ask ourselves this question: how have we come to descend into this pit of depravity, to believe that it is morally acceptable under any circumstances to design and create these weapons? I vividly remember Albert Schweitzer saying when he received the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1954, that in creating these weapons, we had lost our humanity. I certainly agree with him. So what we're watching in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think, are the death throes of the old patriarchal order. It may not be the end of wars, but it's the first time we can really see on our television screens the horror of what one country can do to another, or what other people can do to their brothers and sisters. And the worst abuses are really displayed in this Picasso's agonized commemoration of the bombing of Guernica in 1937. For millennia, young men have been sent to fight and have nobly sacrificed their lives on behalf of their nation. But now, if we're to survive as a species, we have to outgrow this ancient habit somehow. So what can we do? We can speak up for the highest moral values which serve and protect life. These values are ancient and universal, and they override loyalty to any one nation or any government. Certain governments have betrayed these values by spending enormous sums in the last 75 years on accumulating nuclear weapons and other weapons. Ostensibly, they've done so in the interests of defense, but really they've done it in order to gain greater power over other nations, whom they see as rivals in the struggle for supremacy, and to get them to the top table at the UN. So we need to challenge the belligerent ambitions of the leaders of nations who still covertly prepare for war, spending immense sums of our money on weapons. We have to break the spell of this addiction to power that has inflicted intolerable suffering on humanity and is still inflicting it, as we can see, and the sacrifice of generations of young men over 4 millennia, 4,000 years. Think of the anguish of mothers whose beloved sons do not return to them. Up to 21,000 young Russian men have died so far, and many thousands of Ukrainian men. War is the most lethal wound to women who are the bearers and predominant carers of life. So this extraordinary time we're living in is giving us an opportunity to recover the forgotten values which serve and protect life, and to birth a new world. It's going to be very difficult. We may not manage it, but at least we have to try. We're witnessing both the death throes of the old patriarchal order and the birth, or the possible birth, of a new order that renounces the horror of war and the struggle for power between nations. Change is coming and is inevitable owing to the increasing pressure of climate change. But we need to understand the long historical process that has led us to this crucial time of awakening and choice, which is also, in my view, a time of judgment for the whole of humanity, judgment by the cosmos. In this talk, I will take you back many thousands of years so you can understand where, when, and why we went wrong, and the radical change of consciousness that we need in order to birth a different world. So I'm taking you right back 25,000 years here. To begin with, we will look at the cosmology of the Paleolithic and Neolithic eras when the cosmos was imagined as a mother, from whose womb all forms of life emerged in a continuous cycle of birth, death, and regeneration. That is to say, a cosmic womb was the womb of the Great Mother, so to speak. For tens of thousands of years, the ground from which life arose and to which it returned was maternal. What we now call cosmos and nature was a living web of relationships ensouled by the Great Mother. Life was an organic, living, and sacred whole, and we were part of that whole. The Milky Way was the starry passage by which souls entered and left this world, and the shamanic journey into non-ordinary states of consciousness was the spiritual experience throughout this long era. The most important idea about this time is that there was no creator beyond creation. As it were, creation was the Great Mother. There was no separation between the Great Mother as source or womb and all the forms of her life. The Great Mother was both the starry cosmos and all life on earth. All forms of life were her children. So everything was infused with divinity because each and all were part of her sacred cosmic order. Woman was revered because, like nature, the Great Mother, she was the carrier of new life. Now, the cosmology of what I call the lunar era was a cyclical process of birth, death, and regeneration that arose from the age-old observation of the recurring phases of the moon, its birth as a crescent, its waxing to fullness, and its waning into the 3 days of darkness. Out of that darkness, the crescent was continually reborn. So the moon was really our first teacher. It gave us the first image of time. And from that, we constructed all the time things that we live within today. Light and darkness, life and death were not polarized as they were to become in the subsequent era, but were two phases of a total cycle, always leading to regeneration and a new cycle. Through an expanded consciousness assisted by shamanic practices and the use of sacred plants, people in the lunar era saw their lives as part of the great cosmic cycle of birth, death, and renewal, and knew that although the body died, their soul would take a new form in a new life. They saw the whole of nature as alive with spirit, and they knew how to communicate with water, with trees, with stones, and also with animals, plants, and birds, and how to keep in touch with the ancestors. They had an enhanced participatory consciousness that we, unfortunately, have lost. Now I'm going to take you back into something called the civilization of old Europe, which is described in this map here. It includes Italy on the left and Malta down at the bottom, which you can't see. And it includes all of Central and Eastern Europe, particularly the area leading into Ukraine, which is just above the Black Sea, which you can't see. But Ukraine was part of it, which is so fascinating. And so I've said here that we can follow the image of the Great Mother into the Neolithic era. 8,000 years ago, that is 6,000 BC, there was an extraordinary, very early civilization that developed in a large part of Europe. It included Romania and Bulgaria, Moldova and Ukraine, as well as southern Italy, Malta, Greece, and Crete. This Neolithic civilization was matrilineal, agricultural, and peaceful. People lived in harmony with nature and worshipped the Great Mother. For 3,000 years, that's 1,000 years longer than our own Christian era, from 6,500 BC until 3,500 BC, There is no evidence whatsoever of conflict and territorial aggression or defensive hill fortifications. There are no burials of men with weapons. There is no evidence of hierarchy. It was a highly creative and artistic civilization that left a strong cultural legacy in Southeastern Europe that we can still see traces of today, particularly in Crete and Malta. The Lithuanian archaeologist Marija Gimbutas was the first person to reveal the marvels of this hitherto unknown civilization, and she wrote 2 wonderful books about it, The Civilization of the Goddess and The Language of the Goddess. She was ridiculed for years by other archaeologists, but she was finally vindicated in 2018 because they discovered that they had DNA evidence for what she was saying for the first time. So she died, unfortunately, of cancer by then, but she was vindicated. So here is a wonderful image of the Great Mother dating to 5000 BC and found in Romania. A shamanic pathway symbolized by the labyrinth connected the 2 aspects of her being, her earthly being and her cosmic aspect. So at death, we entered that door down at the bottom and we took this pathway, this labyrinthine pathway to her other dimension in order to be reborn in a new cycle of life. Now, here are some magnificent examples of pottery made by these people. And a few years ago, I actually saw them at an exhibition called The Civilization of Old Europe at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And I was stunned by their beauty and also by their enormous size. They were absolutely huge, some 2.5 feet broad and high, or even more, like the one in the middle there with the spiral on it. And there must be similar ones in a museum in Kiev. So I've recently learned that in the early part of the last century, there was a Russian-Ukrainian archaeologist called Vincenti Kivoika, who discovered thousands of tiny images of women or goddesses in Ukraine, as well as large, well-made temples and houses. His discoveries didn't fit with the mindset of the Soviet Union at that time. And so, like the discoveries of Gimbutas, they were ignored for decades. He found that these people were agriculturalists, extraordinary potters, blacksmiths, goldsmiths, and coppersmiths, and consummate weavers. He found the largest amount of worked gold ever found anywhere. And he found many images of enthroned women, like this one from Romania, and images of men with exquisite expressions, carvings of stone so beautifully made that one can see the tenderness of the hands that hold the baby. Every object used in every aspect of life was lovingly ornamented with symbols of nature and with circles, crosses, and endless meanders. I think you can find this on the internet if you look up the civilization of old Europe. Now, the peaceful agricultural civilization of old Europe, which included Ukraine, was brought to an end by 3 successive incursions of Kurgan or Proto-European tribes from 3500 BC to 1500 BC. And these came down from the Russian steppes, bringing with them the horse and lethal weapons and the war chariot. And they spread south and west into Europe and east towards Turkey, Iran, and ultimately India. They brought with them the patriarchal order, sky gods, and the hierarchical organization of society with a warrior leader at the top. And this was the origin, I think, of the patriarchal order, because it spread over a couple of thousand years, as far east as India, where it established itself there, and as far west as Western Europe. So it's rather depressing, really. Europe, including Ukraine, was never the same again, and all evidence of this civilization had vanished completely. Nobody knew anything about it until Marija Gimbutas and Vincenti Kivoika restored it to life. So that was the distant origin, I think, of these great goddesses. Moving forward, we can follow the image of the Neolithic Great Mother as she becomes the great goddesses of the Bronze Age, goddesses such as Isis in Egypt, Inanna in Sumer, and Artemis of Ephesus, all of whom were worshipped as the Queen of Heaven and associated with the moon. So I think that Egypt and Sumer were really contemporary with the civilization of old Europe, obviously in a different part in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. But it was the same idea that underlay all these great civilizations, that is to say, Egypt, Sumer, as well as old Europe. For many thousands of years, the Great Mother and these great goddesses personified the principle of relationship. This is terribly important. The interconnectedness of every aspect of life, and above all, the sacredness of the web of life that we call nature. The primary question of the lunar era was, how should the human community act so as to be in harmony with the life of the cosmos? This is the question that we've forgotten and should be asking ourselves now. Plato, in his Timaeus, was the first to give a name to an all-embracing cosmic entity, which he described as a single living creature that encompasses all the living creatures that are within it. So there you have the idea of a great soul entity, if you like, or great mother goddess who contains everything within herself. He called it the soul of the cosmos. And that's why I called my book The Dream of the Cosmos. The priceless legacy of this whole era was the shamanic experience that the cosmos has an inner life, a soul, and that humans could communicate with it and derive their laws from listening to its voice. The pre-Socratic philosophers Pythagoras and Parmenides were masters of shamanic communication. So we carry within our psyche a very ancient kind of consciousness or experience of life that I call lunar consciousness and associate with the timeless wisdom of the soul. It's an instinctive, feminine, participatory, and relational way of knowing, mediated through the heart, enhanced sensory observation and intuition that opens the path between two dimensions of reality that otherwise remain closed to us. We need to reconnect with this lost consciousness and learn to listen again to what Jung called the spirit of the depth, or the voice of the soul. So now we move on to the next era, which I call the solar era, because the sun replaced the moon as the most important body. And it's the era when the Great Father replaces the Great Mother. And it went from about 2000 BC up until the very present day. So we find a cosmology that is radically different from that of the lunar era. It is a cosmology of separation, characterized by dissociation, duality, fragmentation, and polarization, which resulted from the conflict between cities and nation states to begin with. That's where it all started. During this era, the Great Father replaced the Great Mother as the sole image of deity. And because of this, we lost the participatory consciousness that we'd had in the lunar era, and the sense that we lived within a sacred order, an insight that has only survived to our time in the indigenous cultures of the world. The focus of this whole era is on the establishment of the patriarchal order, led by male warrior leaders, together with the male priesthoods that exist to this day. But it is also about a violent and traumatic separation from the deeper matrix of the soul or psyche, and a severance of our relationship with nature, cosmos, and earth. The rapid growth of the population from around 5000 BC facilitated the drive for territorial conquest led by warrior kings who presided over immense empires. There were at least 7 of these empires that were built on the enslavement of conquered peoples. It started with Sargon of Akkad in 2200 BC and went on to the Assyrian and the Babylonian, the Persian, the Greek and the Roman Empire, and other ones in between. So it really never stopped. And the trauma created by all these conquests was simply horrendous and is still in the collective psyche, which I'm going to return to later on. So with the rise of nations and empires came the idea of power over others and how a certain territory belonged to a specific group. Conquering more territory involved killing or enslaving others. There were 10,000 slaves a day that were traded on the island of Delos in Greece in around 500 BC. So you can see that the slavery was part of this whole thing. This new male conquest for territory, power, and the renown of the conqueror destroyed the old lunar relationship with a harmonious cosmic order. The brutal invasion of Ukraine by Putin, or the invasion of Iraq by the US and the UK, arrogantly named Operation Shock and Awe, are a reenactment of the pattern of war and conquest that has extended through 4 millennia. To the political leader in the grip of an archetypal inflation, the death and suffering of thousands means nothing in relation to the power and the territory acquired through conquest. And we can see this very clearly in what Putin is doing and how he thinks about the whole process of conquest. Now, with the loss of the Great Mother and the Goddess, Western civilization developed on the foundation of a fundamental dissociation between spirit and nature, between creator and creation. This dissociation destroyed the sacredness of nature and the ancient shamanic ability to connect with the soul of the cosmos. It also destroyed our ability to recognize the presence of spirit within the material world, opening the way to its exploitation. It was during this era that we lost touch with the voice of the soul, because religions replaced the shamanic method, as it were, of communicating with the soul. They became a substitute, and they deliberately repressed the older shamanic methods of communicating. So 2 immensely powerful and polarizing cosmologies became the major influence on the social, political, and religious history of Western civilization. The first of these was the battle between light and darkness, good and evil, symbolized by the hero's fight with the dragon. This cosmology projected into the world would lead to endless struggles for power. Ultimately, it would lead to the battle to conquer and subjugate nature in the service of man, which I'll come to later. In the patriarchal religions, the feminine archetype associated with the goddess was split off from transcendent spirit. Nature and the earth were therefore no longer sacred. Man identified himself with spirit, light, and order, and identified woman with nature, darkness, and chaos. 4,000 years ago, man assumed a position of dominance over nature and woman's voice was silenced. Her former ancient role as priestess and healer was forbidden, and her sole value consisted in her being the carrier of man's seed. This archaic belief still prevails among the Taliban in Afghanistan, who have prevented girls over 12 from attending school and have reimposed the wearing of the hated burqa. It's tragic that the women have to go back into that dreadful old control of their lives. The key theme of the solar era is ascent to the light and repudiation of the darkness associated with nature. It's quite a different mindset. The development of the conscious mind in humanity as a whole, thanks to education, together with its stupendous cultural and scientific achievements, can be recognized as the evolutionary achievement of the solar era. But this achievement was built on the widening chasm that opened between transcendent spirit and nature or matter. This whole process was closely tied into the invention of writing and the power that literacy gave to an elite group of very powerful rulers and priesthoods who deliberately destroyed the shamanic practices and rituals of the older order. Now, as the image of deity changed from Great Mother to Great Father, and the divine feminine was banished from the image of deity, our relationship with nature was severed. None of the patriarchal religions taught their followers that we are part of the earth's life and that the earth is part of a sacred cosmic order. The whole emphasis of their teaching was on transcendence, of getting in touch with the spiritual, which was up there in heaven, so to speak, and as far away as possible from earth and from body. So this led to the gradual de-souling of the world and the crisis that we face now. But there was a second polarizing cosmology, which I need to tell you about, that accelerated the loss of the great mother and the great goddess, and with it, our relationship with nature. And this was the myth of the fall of man that was described in Genesis 2 and 3, not Genesis 1, but Genesis 2 and 3. An enormous change in Hebrew cosmology took place in 621 BC, when a group of priests called Deuteronomists took control of the first temple in Jerusalem. Prior to this, the Jewish people had worshipped both a goddess and a god, a queen and king of heaven, who together had created the world. With no question of the male god only creating the world, they did it together. The queen of heaven, whose name was Asherah, was worshipped as the Holy Spirit and divine wisdom, and also as the tree of life, a cosmic tree which connected the invisible and visible worlds, and whose fruit was the gift of immortality, which of course was the gift of the shamanic cultures that had previously held sway in the world, because they knew that we were immortal. The Deuteronomists eradicated all trace of the goddess, removing from the temple her statue and that of the great bronze serpent that symbolized her power to regenerate life. They cut down her sacred groves of trees and smashed all images of her. Then they had the bright idea of creating the myth of the fall, downgrading the goddess into the human figure of Eve, and bestowing on Eve the former title of the goddess, Mother of all living. So we find that in chapter 2 and 3, where Eve is called Mother of all living. In this way, the Jewish people lost the image of their goddess, and leaving Yahweh as the sole creator God. The only place where the teaching and rituals of the first temple survived, I don't know how they survived exactly, but they did, was in the later mystical teaching of Kabbalah, known as the voice of the dove and the jewels of the heavenly bride. And the heavenly bride was Asherah, or Asherah. So Christianity adopted this monotheistic image of God from Judaism, as well as the myth of the fall in Genesis 2 and 3. We never hear about Genesis 1, where God created man and woman in his or her image, his and her image. We don't hear about that. We only hear 2 and 3. So fast forward to AD 325, when something called the Council of Nicaea officially created the Christian myth of Jesus as the celibate, immaculately conceived, only Son of God, whose sacrificial death had ensured our salvation and redemption from sin. At the same council, the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit, was also defined as male. So there was no longer a feminine presence in the Godhead, even though the Holy Spirit had always been feminine up until that time in the Mediterranean cultures, where she was called Sophia. That was her name. Previously, in both the Hebrew and the Greek world, the Holy Spirit had been feminine. And to confirm the divinity of Jesus, in AD 451, the Virgin Mary was declared to be God-bearer, or Theotokos. So in this new patriarchal cosmology, the sole image of deity is the transcendent Great Father. Divine immanence has been lost. Earth is designated a place of exile and punishment for primordial sin. It is no longer sacred. Adam is given dominion over the animals, but he is no longer part of the divine order. He is banished to a world contaminated by the fall and subject to sin, suffering, and death that were introduced into the world by Eve. This is what the myth says, what the whole story of the fall says. So I've only found this out in the 2 years since I wrote The Dream of the Cosmos, since it was published. It's only very recently that I found out this, thanks to a great Old Testament scholar called Margaret Barker, Dr. Margaret Barker. So since Eve was the primary agent of the fall, she took the blame for our banishment from the Garden of Eden. And this led to the unrelenting persecution of women in Christianity, who had the heavy burden of the sin of Eve placed on them by the Christian fathers and generations of Christian priests, culminating in their being tried and condemned to death at the stake by the Inquisition for consorting with the devil who was associated with the serpent in that tree. This immensely powerful myth is the root of the misogyny that pollutes our culture to this day, giving rise to a deep unconscious suspicion, even a fear of women, and a consequent desire to control and silence them. Although great progress has been made over the last 100 years, women are still struggling to gain acceptance and to put an end to domestic violence and rape, which is far more prevalent today than it was 70 years ago when I was a young woman, which is a depressing thought. So from the perspective of our relationship with the earth, this myth and the loss of the goddess and the divine feminine was a disaster. Everything that was once associated with the divine feminine, that is nature, matter, sexuality, and the whole instinctual aspect of life, was excluded from the sacred. Once again, nature, split off from spirit, was effectively de-souled. We lost the awareness that spirit was active and present in the world, and that we could communicate with it directly, and we lost the sense of living within a sacred order. This myth has imprinted us with a negative image of our presence on this planet and placed a heavy burden of shame and guilt, particularly sexual guilt, on our shoulders. The monotheistic cosmology of the three patriarchal religions has led to the situation where the earth is no longer recognized as sacred, and we're confronted with the catastrophic effects of the loss of the divine feminine. From the time of the Crusades, the Christian church in Rome pursued endless wars, conquests, and brutal conversions in the name of its God. We have recently acknowledged the evils of slavery, but it was a series of papal bulls from 1493 that gave the European nations permission to invade, capture, subdue, and enslave, those are the actual words used in the bull, the indigenous populations, and to seize all their lands and possessions. Because of this lamentable history of conquest and subjugation, Western civilization has been on the wrong path for more than 2,000 years, completely out of alignment with the earth and the cosmos. This diagram, now I'm coming to a bit of psychology, because this diagram illustrates how our conscious mind, that tiny yellow triangle at the top of our total psyche, has become detached from the deeper matrix of the primordial soul out of which it has evolved, and has become more and more inflated, thinking that it's the ruler of the roost, so to speak. It can do what it likes. It no longer has any awareness of the psychic depths from which it has emerged, no relationship with nature or the cosmos. The psychiatrist C.G. Jung realized that as the conscious mind gained more and more autonomy in relation to the deeper matrix of the psyche, the whole superstructure of consciousness has become disengaged from the age-old matrix out of which it has emerged. He said, consciousness, thus torn from its roots, possesses a Promethean freedom, but it also partakes of the nature of a godless hubris. So there in this diagram, there's the conscious mind at the top, there's the personal unconscious, which we're vaguely aware of, childhood memories, educational memories, etc. And then the deeper collective unconscious, which we also belong to, or we are part of, which connects us to nature and to the whole cosmic entity, really, that we're embedded in. So I hope that I've managed to make that clear. So this split between the conscious mind and the deeper elements of the psyche is the primary trauma that we all carry, which began with the rise of powerful empires and priesthoods and the loss of the shamanic ability to journey into the inner life of the cosmos through altered states of consciousness. The Czech psychiatrist Stanislav Grof has shown through his method of holotropic breathwork that memories of trauma inflicted millennia ago are still held in the collective psyche. They haven't disappeared. They're still held there, and they are responsible for us repeating the patterns over and over again. And there's a wonderful book called by Thomas Hubl, Hubl, that shows in his book, Healing Collective Trauma, how trauma is like a permafrost that causes us to recreate the same events over and over again until we can melt that permafrost. He's most interesting about that. Now, what happens when the conscious ego has no awareness of or relationship with the deeper matrix of consciousness? It can easily be taken over by what Jung called the shadow and the archetypal powers that exist in this unknown aspect of our nature. It's possible to view much that has happened in the world in the past century as a collective psychosis, a state of possession by our unconscious survival instincts, because that's what's driving the whole thing, is the survival instincts and the fear of other people and the need to protect ourselves against them. Because this whole thing has given rise to the drive for power and control and domination. One example of this psychosis was America's decision in 1945 to split the atom and develop the atomic and then the hydrogen bomb. And from this came the nuclear race and the Cold War with the Soviet Union. From this also came the nuclear weapons developed by the other 7 nuclear powers, with Iran now planning to become the 10th nation to develop this demonic weapon. At the moment, there are 9 nuclear powers, and Iran wants to be the 10th. So now we have Putin brandishing his gigantic nuclear weapon. And we've been told that these weapons protect us. This is what governments tell us, that they're all for your protection. But in fact, they're all about their power, nothing to do with our protection. And they're the greatest threat to our survival, as the Dalai Lama has pointed out. Now, the Minotaur, this is a wonderful etching by Picasso. The Minotaur is a timeless image of what can happen to any one of us when the conscious mind is taken over by the will to power of the unconscious aspect of our nature. The unconscious aspect isn't evil, it's simply unconscious because we don't know about it, and we don't know about how our survival instincts drive us to do things, which we see happening now in Ukraine, that normally we would not do. We're not instinctively desiring the death of our neighbor, but under the influence of these survival instincts, we can do any monstrosity that occurs to us. So technically, this is called an archetypal inflation, and we regress into predatory behavior. And when this happens, we won't hesitate to sacrifice whatever or whoever stands in our way in order to achieve our goal. This applies to any of the so-called great powers of the world, but it also applies to any one of us who is determined to impose our will or the will of our group onto others. And you have to only look at American politics to see what I'm talking about. When this happens, as this image illustrates, the feminine value is sacrificed, and we lose the priceless evolutionary achievement of relationship with and respect for others. This was an incredible achievement, which is now really under threat. So I have this quote from Jung: God's powers have passed into our hands. The powers themselves are not evil, but in the hands of man, they are in appalling danger, in evil hands. The splitting of the atom in 1945 was acclaimed as a great scientific advance and a military advance. But from the perspective of a sacred order, it was a rape of nature and matter. The subsequent bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, obliterating the lives of millions of civilians, was an unforgivable crime against a helpless civilian population. It was justified by ending the war, but nevertheless, it was a terrible crime. It was at this point that, in Albert Schweitzer's words, we lost our humanity. My mother was warned in channeled messages at the time that the splitting of the atom would lead to the splitting of the human psyche and to mass insanity. And that insanity is reflected today in the ruthless struggle for power between the 3 great powers in the world, America, Russia, and China, each of which is still locked into the survival instincts which direct the drive for dominance, preeminence, and control through the continued stockpiling of these dreadful weapons. What is missing in these polarizing situations of archetypal possession is the feminine principle, whose highest expression is the image of the Grail. Calling on this image of the sacred feminine can help us to disengage from a state of possession. And this is also where mothers, speaking about their anguish and their anger at their sons being sacrificed in the hell of war, could also have a profound effect on defusing a polarized situation. Apparently, the mothers of Russia in the Afghanistan war said, this must no longer go on, this must stop. And because of their protest, it did come to, the Russians withdrew from Afghanistan. Now, over recent centuries, we've reached dazzling heights of scientific, medical, and technological advances, which have transformed the physical conditions of our lives on this planet and facilitated a phenomenal expansion of our ability to express the creative genius of our species in many different ways and to communicate with each other through the internet, which is an astonishing and marvelous new ability that we've acquired. But I think it was meant to be, because without this ability to communicate with each other, we can't do anything about birthing a new civilization. It just wouldn't be possible. But we've also suffered a catastrophic loss of soul, a loss of the ancient awareness of the sacred interweaving of all aspects of life, and a loss of the sense of participation in the life of nature and the life of the cosmos. And despite all our religions, a radical misunderstanding of the nature of God. The whole foundation of our lives is missing because we've become disconnected from the cosmos. And now I'm going into one of the reasons we've become disconnected, a most recent reason, which is scientific materialism, or what's called scientism or physicalism today. The long process of our loss of relationship with nature and the cosmos, which has been for the most part unconscious, has led ultimately to the materialist or reductionist science that came into being over the last 3 centuries since the Enlightenment and controls our secular culture and academic life today. And also the political life of the world is completely dominated by this scientific materialism. It has brought enormous benefits through many discoveries, but it's also banished the concept of God and the soul, together with whatever it has defined as non-rational, which include all our psychic abilities, for example. It regards the body as a machine or a mechanism made up of separate parts, rather than a miraculous integrated organism, and insists that consciousness originates in the neurons of the physical brain. So when the brain dies, consciousness ceases to exist. It has concluded that we are the only sentient beings in a dead universe that is without meaning, purpose, or intelligence. So we're basically biophysical machines with no free will. This bleak cosmology, taught in our schools and universities for 100 years, has taken on the power and absolutism of an ideology, and no image describes it better than this painting of the Cyclops, or one-eyed giant, painted 100 years ago by Odilon Redon. In our secular culture, the rational human mind has virtually replaced God and no longer recognizes a dimension of reality beyond the material universe, nor any form of consciousness transcendent to its own. This materialist view of reality, presented as incontrovertible truth, presents one huge problem. We are the only sentient beings in a lifeless universe. As observers, we are separate from the life of nature, which has no consciousness, so they say, and the life of the universe. So these beliefs offer no foundation for morality, which is increasingly vanishing from our world, and no foundation for relationship with the earth and the cosmos. They reduce us, as Yuval Harari has charmingly put it, to no more than hackable animals. Is it surprising that so many people are showing symptoms of mental illness and are driven to drugs and suicide because they feel their lives have no meaning and no value? Now, according to the psychiatrist, Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who has many brilliant talks on YouTube, which I recommend to you, we've become prisoners of the literal left hemispheric mind, which over centuries and millennia has gradually closed down access to the imaginative right hemisphere and has led to the disastrous misinterpretation of reality that's reflected in scientific materialism. I would like to say here that the right hemisphere is connected to the heart. It's actually the first hemisphere of the brain that develops out of the heart of the embryo, which is fascinating. And the left hemisphere develops a little bit later. But make this connection between the right hemisphere and the heart and the soul, because the heart is the, as it were, the direct connection with the soul. So I'm coming to the next part of my talk now. If there's a single idea that is facilitating the subjugation of nature and the devastation of the planet, it is the belief that the earth has no consciousness and that we are separate from its life. Therefore, we can do anything we want to it. We can exploit it as we wish. There's no responsibility. There's no guilt in doing that. We just go on in what we're doing. But now we're beginning to awaken to a totally different relationship with the earth. Birthing a new story is an evolutionary imperative at this time of unprecedented crisis. A new story that can free us from the scientific beliefs and the left hemispheric perspective that have increasingly imprisoned us. Without this awakening, we have no future as a species. Imagine the planet with a ring of light around it, composed of all the people who are trying to bring this new paradigm into being. Now, I've described to you the pathology of the solar phase of separation and a patriarchal order that had no connection with the feminine, that had really deleted the feminine. We have had a religion story and a science story, neither of which has given a complete picture of our origins, our nature, and our role on this planet. At this time of supreme crisis, something is beginning to shift in our species. The soul of humanity is stirring to life from a long and trance-like sleep. The feminine archetype is coming back into our consciousness, bringing with it a new revelation, symbolized by the woman standing in front of the tree of life, holding a child, which is painted by my husband. As this soul impulse gathers momentum, the marriage of our rational mind with our long silent soul is beginning to change our concept of reality. So how do we recover our lost sense of being part of something totally sacred? In chapter 10 of my book, I've defined the feminine as a totally different worldview or paradigm of reality, a different perspective that regards this planet as part of a sacred cosmic order, whose precious life we are meant to protect and to serve. The feminine requires a radical transformation of our understanding of life and our relationships, relinquishing the millennia-long struggle for power between nations and manifesting as a new planetary consciousness which recognizes the interconnection and interdependence of all aspects of life, including ourselves. Like the magma of the Earth's core, the long repressed feminine principle is rising to meet the masculine one in response to a deep soul impulse to balance and marry these two archetypal energies within ourselves and within our world in order to create a new kind of civilization, one that is not destroyed by rivalry between nations, but is raised to a higher level by cooperation between them in service of the planet. We tread a path which is on the knife edge between birthing this new vision and regression into barbarism, perhaps the annihilation of our species on the other. Do we want more of what Putin is doing, or do we want to put an end to it? Now, a door is opening onto a new story, which astonishingly is coming to us from unified physics, which is a branch of quantum physics, as defined by physicist and cosmologist Nassim Haramein. who says, a new cosmology is being born, a new vision of our profound relationship with a conscious, intelligent, and interconnected universe. He compares the astounding recent scientific discoveries to the unfolding of the petals of a rose, like the one in this picture. The revelation of our profound connection to the deepest ground of life and to each other could have a profound influence on how we live our lives, how we relate to the planet, and how we interact with each other, recognizing that our every act and even our every thought has an effect on the underlying intelligent field. This is why I call this an annunciation. It's really a new annunciation of a new story coming into being. Unified physics tells us that the whole universe is a unified field, a cosmic web of life which connects all life forms in our universe and on our planet. So every atom of life interacts with every other atom, no matter how great the distance between them. So none of us is truly separate from anyone else, or from other species of life on this planet, or from the life of the 2 trillion, I should have changed that, 2 trillion galaxies of the universe. That is a staggering revelation, I think. In my life, anyway, it's a staggering revelation. There's Nassim Haramein's words, really. Now, the soul is the cosmic sea of being, or subtle field that underlies and connects all aspects of reality. This new quantum cosmology shows us that the material world exists within a stupendous field of consciousness that is the ground state of the universe. Our human consciousness is part of the consciousness which sustains not only our world, but the entire universe. Each one of us carries the holographic imprint of the universe within us. That's an extraordinary thought too. No matter what our race, nation, gender, or caste, each one of us is part of the living, breathing, connecting web of life which underlies and connects all life forms in the universe and on our planet. I call this web of life the soul of the cosmos. I prefer the word soul to mind because it carries a feminine resonance and also because of the whole past history of it. But scientists will use the scientific word field, which is perfectly legitimate. They don't really use the word soul at all. So quantum physics tells us that our world of matter is like a visible foam resting on a very deep ocean of light that permeates every cell of our being. We are not only connected with each other through the astonishing reach of the internet, but through the infinitesimal particles of subatomic matter that are non-locally connected with each other throughout the universe. In our essence, we are beings of light. We are cosmic beings, incarnated on this planet for an evolutionary purpose and needing physical bodies in order to incarnate. All life at the deepest level is essentially one, and each of us is an expression of that one and inseparable from it. The realization that we participate in a cosmic consciousness that is the source and ground of our own consciousness is shattering the belief that material reality is all there is, that we exist in a randomly created universe, and that our consciousness ends with the death of the physical body, and there is no life beyond death. These discoveries challenge the assumption that we humans are the only conscious beings in the universe, and that we're separate from it and from the life of all species on this planet, and that the universe is without life or intelligence or purpose or meaning. In the nick of time, we are moving from a story of a dead, insentient universe to a universe that is vibrantly alive and the ground of all that we call life. So the old image of God as a distant male creator in a place called heaven is undergoing an alchemical transformation, kind of new wine in new bottles. God or spirit or divine mind may be the invisible ground of the entire manifest universe and the ground of our own consciousness. So divine mind may not be something separate or distant from us, we may be within it, coexisting and co-creating in our own tiny human way with it. This to me is one of the great revelations of our time. If God or spirit is the intelligence and creative energy of the life process itself, pulsing forth at every instant in every region of this vast universe, then how we treat so-called inanimate matter, planetary life, and each other becomes a matter of how we are treating God. In splitting the atom and creating weapons of mass destruction, and in killing others who are our soul brothers and sisters, we are mutilating and desecrating the body of God. Now, I want briefly to summarize the quintessence of Nassim Haramein's discoveries, because I think they will interest you. He says that beneath the visible universe is an underlying electromagnetic field or matrix, like a fabric woven of energy, or a lattice, or a web. There's no such thing as empty space. Space is absolutely full and seething with energy, and it's continually being transformed. And he says that we can't separate consciousness from this field because the field itself is consciousness, imprinting, exchanging, and transmitting information every nanosecond. Consciousness orders and organizes the field and its complex interconnected systems at all levels, and the evolution of the universe itself. And we are part of this stupendous organization of energy, part of that consciousness. In the words of another physicist and cosmologist called Dr. Jude Currivan, we don't have consciousness, we are consciousness. We don't have consciousness, we are consciousness. We can't really separate so-called inanimate matter, animate self-organizing systems like plants and animals, and self-aware organisms like ourselves. All may come to be seen as integrated components of a continuous evolutionary path of information or consciousness growing and unfolding through what we call time. And he says that the entirety of space-time is full of fields, from the electromagnetic field of a single atom to that of each cell in our body, to the heart's electromagnetic field, to the fields of the Earth or the Sun and the 300 billion galaxies. The whole of what we call space is full of electromagnetic fields of different magnitudes, all interacting with each other. Even the atom is a field, and the proton and electron within it are also fields. And this diagram from the Heart Math Institute shows the extent of the electromagnetic field of the heart, which is connected to the electromagnetic field of the Earth. When we are in touch with our heart, when we've made a conscious connection with our heart, then we're connected to the electromagnetic field of the Earth, which I think is absolutely fascinating. Now, he also says that there are 100 trillion cells in our body and 100 trillion atoms in every one of those 100 trillion cells. Each one of these atoms contains a proton, and each proton contains trillions of Planck units. Everything is connected through these infinitesimal Planck units. The size of a Planck unit is like a grain of sand compared to the size of the whole universe. Untold numbers of these electromagnetic oscillators constitute the ground of the material universe. So all so-called matter is made of protons and these infinitesimal Planck units. These basic particles in the field are oscillating and vibrating so rapidly that there is no apparent space between them. And this electromagnetic oscillation is the ground state of the entire universe. This continuous oscillation is so rapid that it makes rapid matter appear to us as a steady state so that everything seems solid to us. We can move around in it, knowing that the chair is not going to collapse beneath us, or that the stove is there when we cook our dinner. So it's just so difficult to grasp this, but I think it's fascinating. So all these infinitesimal Planck units and protons and atoms and cells are connected to each other and to every observer in the entire universe, forming a stupendous field of energy in a continuous state of oscillation. And they produce a holographic structure and an incredible dynamic wormhole-like network which connects all points across scales and generates a connected, living universe. So that's the best I can do to explain these new discoveries in quantum physics to you. And I've chosen this wonderful painting by Piero da Francesca of the resurrection of Christ, because I think that what Jesus was teaching us 2,000 years ago is what quantum physics, as Nassim has explained it, is revealing to us now. We've finally caught up in a scientific sense with what he was teaching 2,000 years ago. We can't separate matter and spirit because matter is spirit, and we're all connected to each other and to the divine ground. He told people not to kill because to take the life of another is breaking the law of life. He said we cannot serve two masters, God and Caesar. And Caesar he often called the ruler of the world or the master of the world. And the ruler of the world is quite simply the will to power that we can see magnified in Putin, as well as in America and China, and the giant corporations of the West, all of which are really usurping the power that is God and using it for their own ends. It's so clear to see, I think, when you put this in the context of what Jesus was teaching. There never has been a more terrible time of persecution, war, and suffering than the last 2,000 years of Christianity. Christ did not usher in a new era through his sacrifice. We are still stuck in the old patterns because we have not begun to understand his message. Yet the way the new consciousness is arising is very similar to what happened in the early Christian communities before the Emperor Constantine took over Christianity in the 4th century, because we're forming everywhere little groups of people like this one who are communicating with each other and then gradually widening out to communicate with other groups. And we're forming a network all over the planet of people who are concerned and committed to bring in a different kind of civilization. So these words from a recent book by a man called Christopher Bache, who's a great friend of mine, recording his psychedelic visions over a 20-year period, give us a glimpse of what is happening beneath the surface of our culture. Later, I can give you the title of his book. The great difficulty I have, he says, is describing the enormity of what is being birthed. The true focus of this creative process is not individuals, but all humanity. It is actually trying to awaken the entire species. What is emerging is a consciousness of unprecedented proportions, the entire human family integrated into a unified field of awareness, the species reconnected with its fundamental nature, our thoughts tuned to source consciousness. The unified field did not suffocate individuality, but liberated it into new orders of self-expression. And the scale of what I was witnessing took my breath away. I saw humanity climbing out of a valley, and just ahead, on the other side of the mountain, was a brilliant sun-drenched world that was about to break over us. The time frame was enormous. After millions of years of struggle and ascent, we were poised on the brink of a sunrise that would forever change the conditions of life on this planet. All current structures would quickly become irrelevant. All truths would quickly be rendered passé. Truly, a new epoch was dawning, and the lives of everyone living in this pivotal time in history were helping to bring about this global shift. So now I'm moving to the end and a kind of summary of what I've come to understand. So divine spirit is the core of our being. This is what Jesus was teaching. He said, the kingdom of heaven is within you and all around you. But somehow that message was lost. The soul is the intermediary between spirit and body. The body is the temple of the soul and the means of our being able to incarnate on this planet. At the same time, it offers us access to the many dimensions of the inner universe and the experience of the divine spirit within us once we become aware of it. So the more we develop the capacity for love and reverence for life, that involves all the people and animals and plants within our community, so to speak, the more we are in touch with this divine spirit. It's not difficult, but it means that we have to learn to love consciously. So the new story is about relinquishing the fear of death, knowing that we survive death and that we are, in our essence, immortal beings. This should take away our fear of death, knowing that it's a kind of passage into another life in different dimensions of reality, I should say. So the new story tells us that cosmic light and love are the foundation of our being and the foundation of the entire cosmos. They're the foundation of our consciousness, our intelligence, and our capacity for love. Imagine this revelation being born in our heart, like the unfolding petals of a rose, as Nassim Haramein described it. The forgotten vision of the lunar era is returning to us at a higher turn of the spiral of evolution. We need now to connect with who we truly are and hold the highest possible vision of what we want for life on this planet and for each other. If the whole universe is one integrated living organism, one symphony of cosmic sound, then we are part of that whole. And like the rose, we participate as co-creators in the unfolding of our life in this miraculous evolutionary process. At the heart of the cosmos is a love of unimaginable dimensions, a love that sustains the entire universe and is the origin of our own capacity to love and to create. To know this is to enable us to heal the pathology of the past, and to know this is the secret longing of the life that lives us. So thank you very much. It was a long talk, but I hope you have enjoyed it.
It was wonderful. And thank you so much. And now I'll open it up to questions, and I have a few of my own. So I might just start it out. That was a very moving presentation, and it really, to me, depicts everything that has transpired and is what we're going through now, and the origins of it make it, I think, clearer in terms of what we need to do and the directions that we need to take. And, one of the things that has occurred to me so many times in recent years, as I learned more about, the divine feminine and how it was supplanted by the solar era and the patriarchy, is that it seems to me that there had to be a purpose behind it, as catastrophic and destructive as it's been. And I don't think it needed to be quite as destructive, but somehow I think we needed to separate, one of the things that you said in your presentation is that we are now we're starting to reintegrate the divine feminine, but at a higher level of consciousness, right? And I think, it reminds me of the prodigal son. He had to leave in order to appreciate, what he had before, and in order to reintegrate to that wholeness. And would you agree with that notion of there being, a constructive purpose to that separation? Not necessarily all the terrible consequences that have come from it, but to that separation so that we could then come back at a higher level.
Yes, I think I would agree with you, awful as it's been, because there have been marvelous things that have been part of it as well. I mean, all the wonderful literature and art, poetry, architecture, incredible things that we've created during those 4,000 years. It's just that we got stuck with the power principle, and we got, or rather those people who are ruling us, the people until recently have had no say in what was happening to them. They had no ability to talk about human rights until the 18th century. Thomas Paine was the beginning of that. So this is quite new, the idea that human beings have rights in relation to the governments, and that governments are there to look after the people, not to use the people for their own ends. Right. So, I agree with you in the long-term thing that there has been a purpose in all this, and that we've now come back, as it were, in Eliot's words, I think, to know the place for the first time. Mm-hmm. We have the consciousness to see what's happened and the consciousness to change.
Yes. And I think that, more and more every day we're seeing the negative consequences in the shadow part of the solar era. As we reintegrate the feminine, what are the shadow parts of the feminine that we need to be careful of, be aware of, so as to avoid them?
Well, they're the same as for the masculine. It's the will to power. You have to watch that in feminist groups and in any individual who assumes power and thinks that that's the be all and end all. We have to just be aware of that and challenge it, and say, where are you speaking from? What are you speaking from? You can't really categorize a whole group of women as being under that spell, so to speak, but you just have to watch out for when it happens. And in all the different spheres of government, including education, care of women, even the birth process of women, that's fallen very much under the shadow of getting women through hospitals as quickly as possible and out the other side. There are things like that which have become normal, which are not normal and need to be challenged.
And making medicine a business.
And making medicine, and God knows, and making money, huge amounts of money out of people through the pharmaceutical industries. Yeah. All this is coming out now. I won't go into it, but it's coming out. And the shadow is really revealing itself to all of us who have the ability on the internet to find out what's happening. So that's positive. We don't have to take any more what we're given. We can challenge, whether it's coming from men, from women, or from a combination of the two.
Yeah. Anyone else have a question or a comment? Kathy?
I guess my question kind of goes along with all that is, it seems as though most people want peace, or they would love to just have a peaceful life, and me especially, I love being connected to nature. I always have, and so forth. That's what I want. And yet it seems like just the power hungry few, that run the corporations, or that, Putin, or just a very few people grasp this power, and then everyone kind of gets sucked up into it without challenging it. You go along with it until there is a new norm, and it just seems like, oh goodness. And yes, now I think there is a rising up, or people are saying, wait, no, that's not okay. And it seems like there has to be this eruption, this ego thing coming up to the top and making this big display until it can be healed and looked at and so forth. But it seems like consciousness has gone backwards, although there is a spiraling up, I know. it just doesn't make sense to me, I guess, that we've lost that divine feminine. And by the way, I love those pictures, those most ancient pictures of the divine mother or the mother. It's like, oh, I want that to be the new norm, the new standard of beauty. But I don't know. Is that what's happened? Like consciousness going backwards, that we've allowed this to even...
No, it's not that. It's the way that communications have worked in the last 50 years or so. It's development recently of the internet so that we could communicate more with each other. But it also means greater control on the part of government over all of us, because things can be started really through, as it were, well, not the word, brainwashing people into certain attitudes or certain beliefs, like religion has done, same sort of thing, and telling them that if they don't do it this way, the bad things will happen, so they have to go along with whatever's they're being told. And that goes for the group as well, even political groups, you know, you either belong to us or you're out, sort of thing. There's a confrontational attitude, and you see it on Facebook and Instagram, which by the way, I don't do any of those at all because it takes up too much time and I don't want to know what people are thinking about me. But people spend a huge amount of time either looking at what other people think about them or telling other people how horrible they are and how they'd like them to be killed, and etc., etc. You know, I mean, there's a fearful amount of just sheer evil which is getting onto the collective psyche through people projecting fear from within their own psyche and in the form of attacking other people. Yeah. And this is new. I mean, this is all since we've had the internet. And Zuckerberg is only interested in money. He's not in the least bit interested in protecting people or children or anything that he says he is. So we have to take steps ourselves, and governments are beginning to take steps now to protect children from what's going on in the internet. But I don't think we've so much regressed as we've got stuck in a kind of mass consciousness, which appears to be very exciting because we can communicate with each other. But if we look at the morality of what's going on, it's really pretty awful stuff. And I think that governments get infected by this as well and think, well, we better be more authoritarian because it's a right mess out there and we have to control everybody more than we have done in the past, so to speak. Now we have the means of control. So people need to be aware of two things. First of all, their own shadow. What are they putting out when they write, I want to see you dead, or I want to rape you, or whatever it might be. Or why not use this method of committing suicide? I can just show 1, 2, 3 how it's done. These are evil things that are going out onto the internet, and people need to be aware of that. And what are they contributing to? And where are they transmitting love and help and kindness and care for their community and everything? And I think it starts in the community. How much are you in touch with your community and your people living next door? Are you looking after your children well, or are they all over the place? You know, there are many things that we can do with our individual lives to bring about a better quality of life for everybody, really. So I've gone on a bit long, it's not really answering your thing, but just commenting on what I think. There isn't exactly a regression, but there's a spreading out of a certain level of consciousness. And now we have to bring it back into focus, saying, what do we really want from this internet and from this communication with people?
Maybe it's just in my insular world, because of course we attract, you know, what we desire or whatever. And so I am surrounded by spiritual people. So I don't see that I hate you and want to rape you, and that's like not part of my consciousness. It doesn't seem like, so I wouldn't say that that's like the dominating thing, but I don't know. I think you're right. It's the fear thing.
It's the fear thing. And also the desire to cancel. Have you heard of the canceling culture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, also it can be very destructive to teenagers who are so, you know, to them, peer pressure is, you know, everything, and peer approval is everything. And they're trying to learn who they are, and the way they learn who they are is by other, seeing other people's reaction to them, and then kids put mean things on the internet, and the ones who are being name called on the internet, they feel it so powerfully that sometimes they commit suicide.
Yeah,
so
they
that's
do.
a very shadow part of
That's a shadow part, the bullying that children are capable of doing in that way, because they didn't have this means before to do that.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And this is something new, and they think it's clever to bully somebody, and the bullying happens all the way through in government departments and in corporations, etc., etc. So I think that once you look at it, I agree with you that it's nice to live, which I do, in a very protected environment. And I'm not open to all these things, although I know that they exist because I read about them and I hear about them from other people. But I think it's important to stay where you are in your protected environment, but at the same time, not to cut yourself off so much that you don't know what's happening in the normal world, what I call the normal world, and that you don't know what's happening in, say, the shooting in the school in America, and the gun law, and all that sort of thing. This is part of the collective culture, which is utterly appalling, and nobody seems to be able to do anything about it because of the entrenched attitude of this group of men, of the people who insist that guns are their right to hold. Nothing seems to be able to budge that attitude, and so children will go on being killed by some individual who is unbalanced, who has the right to get a gun after the age of 18, which is just ridiculous. They shouldn't have guns until they're 30, really.
Right.
Should be a law. But so that sort of thing, one needs to be aware of that side of things, but not get involved with them unless you have an avenue of expressing your voice in your community in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And, it just, so many of us wonder why the US has so many shootings, so many mass shootings where other countries don't. There's no other country in the world that has the number, a daily occurrence in this.
Well, it's because everybody has the right to have a gun, whereas in England, nobody has the right to have a gun unless you have a special license.
But there are other countries where people have guns, like Canada, and they don't have not nearly on the scale that we do. And so there's something about the American psyche that really needs to be looked at in terms of that, I think.
Well, I think it does. I think it goes back to the Civil War, possibly, and the fact that the American psyche is very split deep down in the past and has never been reconciled to what happened at that time, and the separation of the North and the South. I'm 3/4 American, and I lived in America during the war. I was educated there, so I'm a little bit familiar with what happens there. But it is this very intransigent male conviction that they have an absolute right to do what they want with guns, and that nothing is going to stop them, and that is a psychosis, actually.
Yeah,
it's being taken over by the unconscious, and it's the will to power of the unconscious speaking through them, or the survival instinct. They see it as a matter of survival.
Andrea had a question, and for some reason she had to sign off before I got to ask it. She wrote it in the chat. She said, "Thank you for this very informative and exciting presentation." And she said, "I'd be curious to learn more about the DNA evidence that vindicated archaeologist Maria Gimbutas in her findings on old European civilization. Where can we learn more?"
I can't answer that because I don't know enough about DNA, but I do know that I suppose they took samples of blood from people in different parts of Europe and compared them and saw that they were different, and that some had the blood which connected them with the Russian which were a different evolutionary species up in Russia to begin with. They were called, I can't remember, but they were different from the Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis. They were called Denisovans, they were called. They were a different group. And it's possible that the genetic trace of that different group appeared in the blood samples that they took. And then they compared them with the European, say in Italy or Romania or something, and saw that they were different. I don't really know, but I know it was that changed their whole attitude. And it was somebody called Sir Colin, Lord Colin Redcliffe. You can find it on the internet, actually. If you look up Imbutas Vindicated, you'll find the proof probably.
Yeah, so there's no evidence that in that Russian part of the world, there was ever a lunar culture.
Yes, I think there probably was, but Russia has experienced greater suffering than almost any other part of the world, except possibly China, which had terrible, terrible wars between the different regions of it. But the Russian peasants suffered abominably under all their rulers for as long as you can remember. They never had a good ruler except Catherine the Great. And the cruelty of the way they were treated and the cruelty of the Bolshevik Revolution, when each side enacted on the other the most terrible cruelties. There's a book that's just come out about it, which I can't read. But I think that they carry that trauma more particularly than even the European people who have been invaded by Russia. And Russia's been invaded, first of all, by Napoleon, then by Hitler. And it suffered terribly under Stalin. Millions of people were killed by starvation in Ukraine. The peasants were wiped out. So there has been unbelievable suffering there. And I think that may be at the root of the fact that they're so unable to challenge their rulers. They seem to have to accept whatever their ruler says that they must do. I know that there are millions of Russians who don't believe what's going on now, don't agree with it at all, but they have no power to speak up because they're put in prison. I mean, it's a very dreadful regime at the moment. Yeah. If that happened here, we spoke up, we don't get put in prison.
Yeah. And here either.
Yeah.
One thing I've always questioned is, and I don't see it addressed very often, is that to save our physical Earth, it seems like we have way too many people on this planet. But like Gloria says, well, who shouldn't be here? You know, whose soul should not be here? Because we all, I think, chose to be here. But it seems like some of these problems that we have with it, just in my lifetime, I believe we started at 2-something billion people, and now we're almost at 8 billion people.
Yeah. Well, that is a problem. I agree. Yeah. But I'm afraid I have to say that with climate change, many people are going to die because there'll be starvation. There's already, with the grain situation to do with Ukraine, there's already imminent, not yet settled, but the threat of starvation in many parts of Africa and Egypt, which is dependent on Ukrainian grain. So there you have a scenario which could lead to many deaths, many millions of deaths, which may happen. And we will be the witnesses and maybe even the experiences of that situation. Mm-hmm. But I think in the next 50 years, the population will be drastically reduced in one way or the other.
Yeah, I think so too. When people talk about overpopulation, I always think of what Rudolf Steiner said about this era, where he said that in the civilizations of Atlantis and Lemuria, where where they evidently destroyed themselves, that many of the souls from that era refused to reincarnate until civilization had once again reached that level, and that now they would be approaching the millennia. And this was back in the 40s, I think, that he was saying this, that they would be forced to come in because they had to undergo this critical test once again to see if we could avoid destroying ourselves, and so that the population would really boom, because so many souls had to be part of it.
Yeah, well, it may be we just don't know, but it's an interesting idea that. But certainly in our lifetime, my lifetime, I've seen a huge change from the pressure of people everywhere, particularly in the cities. But even for traveling, you know, getting on an airplane in airports, you're with a dense crowd of people. Everywhere there's too many people, even in tourist sites, that they're overwhelmed with tourists, like in Florence and Ephesus, for instance, in Turkey. But this is something that goes with the age that we live in. We just don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. And would you say a little more about Genesis 1? You referred to it, but could you tell us what that was?
Yes, I've got my Bible right here, and I'll find out, read you what it says, because there's a very big difference.
Yeah.
I'm just going to put this light on.
Because it's no longer in there.
Yeah, it's here. Wait a minute, I just got it.
I don't think it's in my Bible.
Yes, here we are. It's Genesis 1, 26, verse 26. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. So if God was only male, he would have only created a male. But I think that something has got lost in translation from the Hebrew. And possibly at the time these translations were made, they couldn't conceive that God would have created woman. And so they just left it as created in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. So it doesn't make sense. Those two sentences don't marry with each other.
Right.
So you'd have to go into the Hebrew and possibly the Greek, because I don't know whether this was translated from the Greek or the Hebrew. I'm not aware which one it was. But I think a lot of mistakes came in because of also the word spiritus sanctus in Latin is male, whereas in the Greek it was pneuma was the word for spirit, which was neither male nor female. Then the changing to spiritus sanctus in the Latin. And you lost the feminine completely then. But the Holy Spirit was feminine, as I said before, in the first temple of Jerusalem.
Yeah. And could you also say more about the tree of life?
Yes, well, the tree of life, as I say, that the goddess was the tree of life. And in Kabbalah, those of you who know anything about Kabbalah, that is the main image in Kabbalah, is the tree of life. And you have the divine, male and female, creator and creatrix at the root or the source. And then you have all what they call the Sephiroth, the great powers coming down from the source, both male and female. And then you have one in the middle, a column in the middle, which is where they all kind of meet. And Tiphereth is called the heart center of that central column. So you have the male and the female. There's no question of male only. And you have the male and the female in the Godhead as well. And it's the only cosmology I know of, apart from the Indian, that has the male and female in the Godhead.
And the tree of life became the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the Deuteronomist version.
In the Deuteronomist, they put the tree of knowledge into the garden, which wasn't there originally. Possibly, I mean, you can interpret it in a different way. You can say the tree of knowledge was there in order that we should develop consciousness and eat from the fruit of the tree.
Right.
But it was interpreted negatively. And it was interpreted that woman brought all these disasters into the world, so to speak. So they didn't interpret it in the psychological way of seeing it as a necessary step in our evolution, if you like.
Right.
But the tree of life the goddess was called the tree of life. That was her title, as well as divine wisdom and the Holy Spirit. Those are the three titles that she had. And
Yes,
the tree of life connected the different with the invisible world with the visible.
yes.
And so that there was no break, as it were, between creator and creation.
Right. Yes, and Carl Jung used the tree as an image for the human, the branches going up to heaven and the roots going down into the unconscious. And
that's right. Yes, he took that. And also you have it in the Indian system with the chakra system. It's really a tree, if you like, and with different levels. And you have it in that Gospel of the Beloved Companion, where Jesus tells Mary Magdalene that she has to ascend the boughs of the tree. And that is so beautifully expressed. So he says there is a tree within you, which is within your body, which is your body, he says. And then you climb the trees which are within you. And the fourth level is where you have to encounter what he called the ruler of the world. And that's what Mary Magdalene had to encounter before she moved on to the 5th, 6th, and 7th and 8th levels.
That's interesting, because that would be the heart chakra, which connects the lower chakras to the higher chakras. The fourth.
Yes, in that different system, yes. So you wouldn't associate the heart with the ruler, the power symbol.
Well,
really.
Except that the heart is the center of love, and love is the highest power. So if you're aspiring to the highest power, that's the power of love.
Then you would have to move through the heart, definitely. But you would have to, at the same time, reject the temptation of the power of the world, to have power in the world, which comes from fear, pure and simple. It comes from ignorance of what we are and why we're here, and fear of death.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's what's behind all the wars, all the discrimination, all the racism, everything. Maria, would you like to ask a question out loud, or you want me to read it?
She needs to unmute.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my mouse wasn't letting me unmute. Okay. So I have so many questions, and I'll start with a lighthearted one. So the first one was, when you showed us the 21 figurines, there were 13 and 21, and I was intrigued by the significance of the number 13, just because I have seen it in other, I guess I've seen it referred. What I've heard is something of 13 being 12 and 1, 12 and then 1. I was just curious if you know any of the significance behind those numbers.
Not at that time, which was roughly 5000 BC, so I wouldn't really know what it meant then. But it could have been connected with the moon, something to do with the moon, the 12, the 13. Oh yes, I know what it is. It's the 13 months of gestation in a woman's womb that the child takes before it's born. So that was a sacred number. That's the number of moons that had to be full before the child was born.
Oh, I see. 13 moons.
13 moons, yes.
Is in 9 months.
Yeah, exactly. We say 9 months, but then they would have said 13 moons, and they would have watched the moons as they went by, until they knew which moon would be when the child would be born. So I think that's the origin of the importance of 13.
And then what would the 21 be?
21, I don't know.
Yeah, because 28 days is the lunar cycle. So 21 would be 3/4 of that.
Yes, it might have had a meaning then. I really wouldn't be able to say.
Anyway, all right. So that was my first question. Let me see my second question. Are you familiar with Anastasia, the Ringing Cedars books by Vladimir Magre?
No.
Okay. This was just a comment. I felt that the Ukraine situation is not just Putin's ego, but some external pressure from the military industrial complex that did not have any purchases during 2 or more years of COVID. And I was just wondering, that was just like some intuition that I had. And I just wondered if anybody felt that like things are being manipulated even higher than, these countries by this globalist, corporate agenda.
Well, I mean, I think we are partly to blame for the Ukraine war and NATO, because we had assured Russia, or the Soviet Union at that time, that we would not expand NATO any farther east. They said not 1 inch to east of what it was when it was formed. And we have, broken that promise more than once and gotten closer and closer to Russia. And I think, I think both sides are to blame. I mean, that certainly doesn't exonerate Putin and the terrible things that he's doing. It certainly doesn't. But, I think he felt pressure to do something. And I also think he didn't expect the kind of reaction that he got, because when he went into Crimea and took that, nobody hardly said anything, So I think he was very surprised. But, I feel for the Russian people and the Ukrainian people who have to, die and suffer and go through this. But I don't think we can just blame it on Russia. I think,
Yes, it's a complex situation which has gone on since 1945. I mean, since the atomic bomb was first created and the rivalry between America and Russia, or the Soviet Union. But apparently during the COVID period, Putin kind of retired into himself and he began to study Russian history, and he got the feeling that Russia should be what it used to be. He got a real complex and inflation. And I think that's behind it. I don't think it's the generals pushing him. I think he's the boss, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think he felt increasingly threatened by Ukraine wanting to join NATO also. But unfortunately, his actions have, I mean, I don't know where it'll land in terms of Ukraine joining NATO, but now other countries like the Scandinavian countries, Finland and Denmark, is it, are joining NATO, in response.
No, it's Finland and Lithuania who are.
Lithuania,
NATO.
yes.
Yeah,
Lithuania.
because they're right smack next to Russia, and they don't want to risk being overrun, because they were part of the Russian Empire before, and so people are frightened who live there that he might want to take them back into the Russian Empire, which is quite understandable. Yeah. But I think I remember reading somewhere not long ago that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons not long ago.
Yes.
In return. But what did they give them up for? In return for protection from Russia, was it?
I don't remember, but I know I read that too. I'd have to look that up.
I'd have to look it up too. But it just struck a sort of a kind of bell there that I didn't know enough about. Yeah. But it's a very tense situation, but it's so dependent on the will of these leaders, and the will of the people is not really taken into account. And also there are these biolabs, these what's called gain of function laboratories, where they're messing around with viruses and God knows what everywhere, not only in America, Canada, Ukraine, Georgia, but we don't know where they are, but there's just masses of them, and scientists are messing around with these things. So that's part of it as well.
Well, it's where Lyme's disease originated, with the military, messing around with biowarfare, infecting ticks to be dropped on the enemy to weaken the enemy. And then they were doing that on a small island off the coast of Lyme, Connecticut. And suddenly people in Lyme were getting sick and they didn't know what was wrong. And now it's all over the Northeast and spreading to the West.
That's terrible.
So just a terrible disease.
It is a terrible disease. It's nearly fatal. But that again is an example of being separate from nature and thinking that we can do anything we want with it. to get a certain result with disastrous effects.
Yeah. I think it's important to mention also when we talk about, the shadows of the solar era and patriarchy, that these things are also toxic for men, not just
absolutely.
for women. And could you say something about that?
Yeah. I think men have suffered as much as women because, first of all, during these 4,000 years, the one thing you were brought up to be was a warrior if you were a man. If you were crippled or had some handicap that you couldn't be a warrior, then possibly you became an artist or something else, But your destiny from a time you were a boy was born, was that he should be a warrior and that he should join the army or whatever it was at that time to fight for whatever the ruler had decided wanted to fight. If it was conquering. In Greece, it would have been conquering the islands, or in Rome, it was creating an enormous empire. Alexander the Great had a huge army that took all the way to India. And men had to suffer this risk of death and disease and being wounded and all sorts of things all through this time. And they didn't have another kind of image of what they could be, unless they were fortunate in having an artistic gift or some sort of gift which put them outside the general run of male warriors. And I think that's been a terrible suffering for men because it's diminished their psyche, and it's made them very much have to obey the peer group that they're in. The young man wants to be like everybody else, so he joins up with all the other ones. And they had no choice at all. And I think that was a dreadful wound, really, for them, because it diminished their feminine nature. They had to disguise their feelings. They have to suppress their feelings. I mean, even my father, I remember, had to completely repress his feelings all the time because he was in the army and fought against Hitler and everything. So he had no place for feelings whatsoever in his life. And so it's very difficult for men to make relationships with women and also with their children because of that, because they had to bring their children up in a certain way to conform with what society demanded of what a man should be telling his children and the way he was bringing them up. And his will was completely law. Women had no say in the way children were brought up. They had no property rights. They had no rights at all until well into the 20th century. So that diminished their men's relationship with women was curtailed or diminished. And women, in a way, carried their feeling for them. They could express it themselves, saying, this is not the way to treat the children or whatever. But they didn't have much power to do anything, to change anything. Whereas the man had the absolute right to rule the household, and still has in many societies in the world. I mean, look at the Taliban and that whole Muslim psychosis, really.
Yeah.
So I would agree that men have suffered as much, if not more, than women in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I think it's important for them to know that as well,
Yes, I think it is, because they don't want to be marginalized, and they don't want to be told that they're the responsible for everything that's gone wrong, because they're not.
Yes.
What was responsible were the political and religious rulers. Those were the people who were responsible, but not the great mass of humanity at all, and certainly not the great mass of men.
Well, we're almost out of time. Maria, did you have one more question?
I have more than one question. I don't know. So I was curious in this spiral dynamics evolution, Roe v. Wade in the USA, and I was just wondering what your thoughts were about that, Anne.
About the abortion?
Yes, about the overturning of Roe.
Overturning that. Well, I think it's been done, everything has been done in a very clumsy, brutal way, which is, I'm afraid, the American way of doing things at the moment. But it gives no right to the woman, completely overrides her feelings and her, what she feels about having the child or not wanting the child. And it really, again, imposes the patriarchal will on women, which I think is utterly wrong. It's a regression in that sense to 100 years ago or 50 years ago. And that Roe v. Wade was a tremendous step forward in helping women to have autonomy and have a sense that their will counts for something. But I need also to speak about what the sexual revolution has done, because I think it's been disastrous for women, because it's given them the idea that sexual promiscuity is okay, and they haven't known how to protect themselves really from becoming victims of men. So they've become victims of men as much as they were before, but in a different way. And men have become victims also of this sexuality, the pornography, etc., which diminishes them and completely distorts their true nature and completely distorts their relationship with women. So the whole thing is in a mess, a real mess. And I don't know how it's going to come out, but I think that women need to be far more protective of their own value, sexual value, as well as every other value. They need to be sure that they're not sleeping around with anyone, because that diminishes sexuality to something that is just a function, which it's not. So the whole thing needs to be thought through very carefully, instead of everybody screaming at each other about their rights. Really, a look needs to be taken at the whole sexual revolution, at the Me Too movement, from the Weinstock men who exploited women. But what were women doing allowing themselves to be exploited? Why had they no sense of their own value? Why didn't they give them a slap in the face or a kick in the pants or whatever? Instead of accepting in order to get on with their careers, you know? They sacrifice their own being in order to get higher up the ladder. And these are all the wrong values.
Right.
So we really need to look at the whole values system and what is really directing it, and maybe try and improve it in some way, I think. There's a book that's just come out in England by a woman called Sarah Perry, I think it is. I can't remember the title, but it's showing how the sexual revolution really has not been good for women, has diminished them and given them a less of a sense of their own value than they had before.
Yeah, well, we have a lot of work to do.
Yes.
We certainly have.
A lot of heart meditation.
Yes, over the heart.
Yeah, heart meditation is very important, most important.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and thank you. And we're just about out of time, but I wanted to mention that there is so much more in this book, The Dream of the Cosmos, than we are able to cover in 2 hours, even with Anne's wonderful presentation and the questions. There is so much more that I encourage you to read it. And actually, I was going to put out a flyer about this and I haven't had time, but I am going to offer a study group reading that book. And so you're all invited to join, and you'll see the flyer when it comes out. And would you tell them the URL to your website?
Oh, my website. Yes, there are 2 websites.
Yes,
two
there are
websites.
2.
The old one is ann-baring.com. That's the original one, which has got masses of stuff on it, which might be of interest. And the second one is called just annbaring.com with no hyphen. And that's got my whole list, my playlist with all my talks, all my lectures, webinars, etc. And it's got a lot of other things. It was redesigned for me about 2 years ago, and they did a wonderful job putting the essence of the Dream of the Cosmos onto that website.
Yes.
So I would recommend that, definitely.
So thank you again for giving us your time.
Yeah, lovely. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you all.
It was great.
Say goodbye.
Bye.
Lovely to meet you. Bye.